So we're sharing an EDS patient community survey and some results about the feedback that we got about the road to 2026 and the reclassification that's coming up. So here's a quick overview of the survey results. First, in the series of questions, we asked people what their age was. And you'll see that the median response, as shown on the screen, is in the range from 35 to 44 years old. The next question is, what's your gender? And you'll see that 86% of people identified as female, which goes along with the conclusion that this is predominantly identified in women. The question of where do you live? Respondents overwhelmingly responded from North America and next from Europe and Australia. The next question is, have you been officially diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypermobility spectrum disorder? And the overwhelming response of 86% is yes. The second most common is suspected but not confirmed. The next question asks, what is your diagnosis subtype? And here again, over 500 responses, about 75% of the respondents say hypermobile EDS, HEDS is the subtype that they've been diagnosed with. The next question asks, how long ago were you diagnosed? And most people responded within 1 to 5 years. And then after that, it follows 6 to 10 or less than a year. Here's where the survey gets a little more interesting and starts asking about your level of familiarity with the current EDS and HSD classification system. And this question asks how familiar people are. And we get a broad range of responses from moderately familiar to very familiar to slightly familiar. So there's not a lot of statistical significance in this response. The question here is, do you understand the diagnostic criteria for your specific EDS or HSD type? And overwhelmingly, 72% say yes, they do. This is a little bit where there needs to be some more digging into this part of the responses in the survey, where the question asks a multiple choice question on how would you rate the clarity of the current classification system, and notes that they're defining clarity as, like the existing content about the hallmark signs or features or diagnostic criteria, not your individual presentation or your health literacy. Just the clarity of the current classification system is the question. And overwhelmingly, the responses are 33% somewhat unclear, with following soon behind that with a little bit of somewhat clear and neutral. So again, this is not a very clear area that we could dive further into to learn more about. This question is where I think the meat of what we need to learn from the survey lies, in the question of, have you encountered challenges in understanding how your subtype relates to your symptoms? And this is 55% of respondents say yes. So what this translates to me is people don't have the understanding of the basics about the disorder, whether it's their subtype or in general, and they need a better education on how to understand their disorder. This is the most interesting finding, in my opinion, when the question asks, have you been denied treatment or accommodations due to a misclassification or a lack of diagnosis? And 62% of people say yes, which is very telling that the lack of awareness, the lack of education, and the lack of communication tools that patients really need to be able to have better discussions with their doctors is really lacking. And this is what I hope will be the big takeaway from this survey, is the lack of resources and information is really impacting people's care and denying their access to treatment. This is another really critical piece of information from the survey when the question is, do you feel having a formal diagnosis might have improved your access to appropriate care? And 65% of people say yes. So again, the information being critical to them having access to care based on the fact that they had a formal diagnosis. The question of, do you feel you've experienced delays in diagnosis due to unclear classification criteria? Over 400 respondents at 66% said yes, that they did. There's also a fairly high response rate of 22% that said no and 12% that said they weren't sure. But this is an interesting finding. The question of, do you believe your healthcare providers understand the specifics of your EDS or HSD subtype? 394 respondents, representing 64%, said no, while 29% said somewhat, and only 6% said yes. The question of, how often do you feel that knowledge of EDS or HSD classification helps your healthcare providers make better treatment decisions, is statistically kind of all over the board, with 6% saying never, 18% saying rarely, 34% the leading target saying sometimes, 26% saying often, and 15% saying always. So another area that needs more investigation on this question. The question of, how often do you feel isolated due to the complexity of your diagnosis is really telling in terms of the mental health impact of Ehlers-Danlos or hypermobility spectrum disorder, where in the responses here, 43% of people that responded to the survey said it often feel isolated, and 26% said they always feel isolated. So I believe that tackling the isolation factor and the mental health factor and the impact that this has in the inability for people to get information and communicate effectively with their doctors, and how this is critical to be included in the reclassification and the road to 2026 that's happening right now, is really important to be paid attention to. The question of, do you feel your EDS or HSD diagnostic classification aligns with your health experience, meaning your signs or your symptoms or your presentation? 64% of people said yes, 20% said no, and 16% were uncertain. Another really telling question in survey results here is the question of, have you faced social stigma or misunderstanding related to your EDS or HSD classification? And an overwhelming 69% of people, of 414 responses out of the over 600, saying yes, they have faced social stigma and misunderstanding. So again, the criticality of the mental health aspect of this disorder has on people, and their lack of being able to get access to information or access to care is a point that cannot be overlooked. The question of, has your knowledge of the classification system affected your mental health, meaning your emotions, psychologically or socially? And the example is given the awareness or lack thereof of the classification system, and if it had an impact on your personal care or access to care related to content or clarity of the system. The responses are across the board, with 13% saying very negatively, 34% saying somewhat negatively, And then 36% saying no impact, 12% saying somewhat positively, and 3% saying positively. So again, I think another area to be able to dig down into to understand how the knowledge of the classification system can impact and relate to mental health. The question of, do you believe the reclassification team's previous work, published in 2017, to improve the classification system was effective? 21% said yes, 28% said no, 49% said they were uncertain, and nearly 2% said they preferred not to say. The next few questions are asking about the types of tools that might be helpful as a requested piece of communication content to be able to come out of the road to 2026. And the question here asks, how useful would the tool of simplified definitions and explanatory terms be in helping you understand your EDS or HSD type? And the responses are across the board, with 7% saying not useful, 18% saying slightly useful, 32% saying moderately useful, 30% saying very useful, and 12% saying extremely useful. Again, another question about the usefulness of a tool. This one is asking about online interactive diagnostic tools, with 6% saying not useful, 13% saying slightly useful, 26% saying moderately useful, 37% saying very useful, and 18% saying extremely useful. The question of how likely are you to use a digital platform or an app to learn about your EDS and HSD subtype has a strong response, with 32% saying somewhat likely and 49% saying very likely. Asking again about the usefulness of a tool, a patient handbook apparently ranks very highly, with 22% saying moderately useful, 37% saying very useful, and 26% saying extremely useful. Here the patient community speaks up with the responses to the question of, do you feel it is important for future reclassification updates to address the variability in symptoms across subtypes, with 60% of respondents saying it's extremely important and 28% saying very important. This is a strong response in this survey. Again, another really strong cry out from the community to the question, do you feel it is important for future reclassification updates to address the complexities of commonly seen comorbid conditions, such as dysautonomia and or mast cell disorders, with 75 or 74% of respondents saying it's extremely important and 18% saying very important. The question of how likely are you to recommend resources or tools once they're published from the upcoming 2026 EDS HSD reclassification to others based upon your current experience has 2% saying very unlikely, another 2% saying somewhat unlikely, 17% feeling neutral, 28% saying somewhat likely, and 50% saying very likely. So there's a lot of people waiting for information to be able to be published on this, and people are very likely to share it in their communities. So we're relying on you guys putting out some great communication tools to be able to help us navigate the EDS and HSD journey.